friend Michael Haken has trouble filling a particular spot, he says, well, I know that Brother Finn is not going to be busy and I can always lure him to Southern Seminary. And so I come and I pinch hit. But I'm really excited about this topic today. It's a topic that I'm keenly interested in personally, and it's a topic that I hope many of you will find very interesting as well. I've titled this paper, Communism and Persecution, Snapshots from the Baptist Tradition. The great Baptist historian Leon Macbeth penned the following words almost 30 years ago on the eve of the collapse of European communism. Quote, "The confrontation of Christianity and communism is one of the most important historical realities of the 20th century. Government persecution of Christians in communist lands has attracted world notice and has become a part of the human rights discussion between the political superpowers of the East and West. Not since the Roman Empire, perhaps, has the world seen a more determined government attempt to stamp out or at least severely limit Christianity." Many Christians are at least passingly familiar with the idea that believers were periodically persecuted in the ancient church and off and on throughout Christian history. In fact, that's what we've been talking about at this very conference. And in a crowd like this, many of us now know, if not before, that our Baptist forefathers and our Anabaptist awkward cousins endured significant persecution from state churches. In fact, we've heard several addresses on these topics, some even in the last hour. But did you know that historians, missiologists, and journalists routinely claim that more Christians were martyred in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries combined? Let me give you just one example. The Italian journalist Antonio Sohn estimates that of the 70 million Christians who have been martyred over the past 2 millennia, at least 45.5 million of them were killed in the 20th century. That is 65% of the Christians that we can conservatively estimate have been martyred for the faith over the last 2,000 years. By the way, scholars and pundits also agree almost unanimously that Christians remain today the most persecuted religion in the world. But that's a topic to be addressed through prayer tonight rather than a plenary session this morning. Much of the persecution that took place in the 20th century can be laid at the feet of communism. From the very beginning, communism has been militantly atheist. Communist governments have routinely suppressed the freedom of religion, and especially evangelical forms of Christianity. Baptists in communist lands have not been immune to persecution, and Baptists in the West have advocated for their brothers and sisters who are being persecuted in communist lands. This still goes on today, even though communism is no longer the global power that it was a generation ago. When Dr. Haken asked me to speak on communist persecution in the 20th century, I immediately asked if I could narrow my focus to the Baptists. And since Dr. Haken and I both love us some Baptists, he readily agreed to my request. So rather than talking about Christian persecution writ large, I'm going to focus upon Baptist persecution as being broadly representative of the sorts of suffering that believers from a variety of traditions, and especially evangelical traditions, endured at the hands of communism. Now, I want to shoot straight with you before I really dive in. To attempt any sort of comprehensive account of Baptist persecution under communism would be a fool's errand. Simply put, there are still way too many stories that we don't know about. Fortunately, a new generation of mostly European Baptist historians is beginning to uncover these stories, and I'm going to lean heavily on some of them in this address. Since a grand narrative isn't possible over the next few minutes, I want to do two things. First, I'll offer some background information about communism and persecution to help orient us to the topic. I'll call this maybe the 40,000-foot view. And then I will zero in, if you will, and offer some snapshots that are related more specifically to Baptist persecution in communist lands. So let's begin with communists and persecution, the 40,000-foot view. Before there was radical Islam, as a global movement at least, there was communism. Now, most of you here in this room are probably not old enough to remember what it was like when communism was all over the news as the single biggest threat to global democracy. It all began almost a century ago. In October 1917, following the overthrow of the Russian Tsar and a short-lived provisional government, a communist political movement called the Bolsheviks gained control of Russia. And in 1922, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, Russia became the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, often shortened to the Soviet Union by those of us in the West. Following Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin led the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades, during which time communism became a global power. Communism was shaped by the writings of the 19th century philosopher Karl Marx, who argued that capitalism inevitably leads to class struggle between owners and laborers. Communists believed that the state should control the means of production, ostensibly eliminating class distinctions, and they would hope alleviating class struggle. Marx's own anti-religious views also infused communism from the very beginning with a commitment to atheism, and that's going to be a topic that I return to several times in this paper. Most Western nations were opposed to communism, though the threat of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party led America, Great Britain, and other capitalist democracies to ally themselves with the Soviet Union during World War II. Following that war, the Allied nations carved up Germany and much of Eastern Europe. Soviet efforts to expand their influence into Europe were routinely met with stiff resistance from the Western nations, and especially from America. What has been called a Cold War ensued between the rival powers as each nation attempted to develop more advanced weapons and expand strategic alliances to hinder the influence of their rival. America and the Soviet Union were the two global superpowers of most of the 20th century. And between them, they had the capability of ushering in a nuclear holocaust if the Cold War ever went hot. The Cold War dominated the global geopolitical scene for almost 50 years. And just as an aside, if you don't know this already, the leading scholar of Southern Baptists in the Cold War is Matt Hall, who serves as administrator and teaches church history here at Southern Seminary. My parents grew up during the hottest years of the Cold War. Right before they were born, America was involved in the Korean War to prevent the communists in North Korea from gaining control of the democratic southern half of the Korean peninsula. As Mom and Dad were coming into the world in the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union was establishing communist puppet states all over Eastern Europe through what was called the Warsaw Pact. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was constructed, formally dividing Germany into a communist state named East Germany and a democratic state called West Germany. In 1959, socialist revolutionaries took control of Cuba under the leadership of a charismatic activist named Fidel Castro. In 1962, Castro provoked the Cuban Missile Crisis when he asked Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to place nuclear missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the southern coast of Florida. The world was briefly on the razor's edge of nuclear war. But fortunately, it didn't happen. Around the same time, America was escalating its military presence in Vietnam, ultimately resulting in an undeclared war with the communists of North Vietnam that lasted until 1975. President Nixon visited what was then called Red China by Americans, a nation with aspirations of challenging the Soviet Union for communist supremacy. I came of age in the final years of the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. I watched news clips of President Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin in 1987 demanding that Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev tear down this wall. I watched the Tiananmen Square massacre unfold on television in June of 1989 when the Chinese government brutally crushed student protesters who were pressing for democratic reforms. I watched the Berlin Wall open in November of that year and then begin to be demolished in June 1990 following the reunification of Germany. Perhaps the part of that stands out in my mind the most is that, of all people, David Hasselhoff gave a concert at the Berlin Wall, which was a sign that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. In December 1991, Gorbachev resigned as Soviet leader following a failed coup d'etat against him. In the following month, January 1992, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved. Already by that time, historians were dating the symbolic end of the Cold War to 1989, the year that the Berlin Wall opened up. Today, only 5 nations are still technically considered communist: Cuba, Laos, North Korea, Vietnam, and China, though I'd argue that China could probably better be characterized as a totalitarian capitalist nation than a true communist state. I think that that's a debate that scholars of global affairs are having amongst themselves right now. A 6th nation, Venezuela, isn't officially communist, but is strongly influenced by its Communist Party. So if not exactly relegated to the dustbin of history, at the moment communism has been weighed in the balance and found wanting by nearly every nation on earth. And that is vastly different than the case was even 40 years ago. In the Soviet Union, persecution began in the late 1920s and continued throughout the communist era. In Soviet-controlled European states, church buildings were confiscated, Christian schools were routinely shut down, and local officials harassed pastors and other leaders. In Czechoslovakia, the modern-day Czech Republic, Baptists were persecuted more than any other group except Roman Catholics. In East Germany, Baptists worshiped in relative freedom, though their outreach efforts were stifled, and they were cut off from Baptists in West Germany. In Poland, Baptists were socially ostracized and forbidden to distribute any Christian literature. Following the Communist Revolution in China in 1949, all Christians were pressured to align with the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, a state-sponsored Protestant denomination, and all other Christian groups were declared illegal. Wherever the Soviet Union and increasingly China exported communism to other parts of the globe, it almost always resulted in the oppression of Christians. Baptists declined numerically in nearly every nation where communism controlled the government, and often were forced to merge with other denominations into these free church conglomerates that were under state control. Baptists often lost their distinctive identity because of these forced mergers with other denominations. In many communist nations, Baptist churches were forced to meet in secret, much like some of the earliest English Baptist churches of the 17th century. Communist authorities targeted pastors, and many were imprisoned, tortured, and sometimes even executed. We heard a little bit about this today when we heard about the Voice of the Martyrs. Others were deported or voluntarily fled, most often to Britain or North America. Global communism also represented a direct threat to Baptist missionary work. Generally speaking, communist nations were closed to Western missionaries, most of whom were deported. Hundreds of missionaries were ousted from China after Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China in 1949. Many of the exiled missionaries were Baptists from America, Canada, and the British Isles. North Korea was closed to missionaries after the Korean War, though missionaries were able to work closely with Baptists in South Korea, trying to find ways to get the gospel into North Korea. Free will Baptist missionaries were forced out of Cuba in 1960 following that nation's communist revolution, and 9 years later, the Southern Baptist missionaries also had to go home. Though Africa was less influenced by communism historically, Baptist missionaries feared that post-colonial Africa was ripe for the communist picking. Consequently, evangelical presence in some African countries was minimal, simply because of the threat of communism, among other concerns. Many Southern Baptists were convinced that missionaries were on the front lines in the battle between Christianity and communism. Missionaries who were able to work in communist lands provided Baptists in the West with first-hand accounts of persecution, as well as other religious rights violations that weren't directly related to Christian persecution. Southern Baptist missionaries in Southeast Asia were ardent supporters of America's war in Vietnam because of religious oppression by the communist government in North Vietnam. Some Baptist missionaries suffered death threats and occasionally even martyrdom at the hands of communists. For example, when a communist coup in Indonesia was thwarted in 1965, a list of individuals to be exterminated was discovered, and it included almost all the Baptist missionaries that were in the country. I'll talk about the most famous Southern Baptist missionary martyr in just a few minutes. Matt Hall argues, quote, "One primary and recurring theme in Southern politics and culture throughout the second half of the 20th century was that of the Cold War and fears of communist threats. This was often couched in explicitly religious terms as Americans, and Southerners in particular, saw this conflict as a holy war," close quote. Well, this was certainly the case with Southern Baptists, who offered steady, vocal opposition to communism and regularly denounced it for stifling religious freedom. Billy Graham, a Southern Baptist evangelist who was without doubt the most influential preacher in America during the second half of the 20th century, regularly preached against godless communism at his evangelistic crusades. The Southern Baptist Convention and various state conventions routinely denounced communism in resolutions, and Baptist state papers periodically editorialized against the pernicious influence of communism. Other theologically and socially conservative Baptist groups have much the same story when it comes to communism. But even centrist to liberal Baptist denominations, such as the American Baptist churches in the USA and the Progressive National Baptist Convention, were also resolutely critical of communist repression of religious freedom, even if these more left-wing groups were less excited about the Cold War itself. They recognized the threat that communism posed to Christianity. Some Baptists were caught up in anti-communist conspiracy theories. Just imagine what it would be like if they would have had Facebook back then. But I digress. For example, independent Baptist fundamentalists such as J. Frank Norris and John R. Rice were convinced that communists had infiltrated the government, schools, and even local churches. In 1947, Norris accused Southern Baptist Convention President Louis Newton of being a communist sympathizer after Newton visited Moscow and came back and reported that Russian Baptists weren't being persecuted. By the way, Newton wasn't a communist sympathizer. He was just a dope when it came to that. They duped him while he was there. They fooled him. In 1960, a right-wing group accused over 600 ministers in the ABC USA of holding communist sympathies. Southern segregationists often and incorrectly accused Baptist civil rights leaders of being communists, especially Martin Luther King Jr. For the record, King was a socialist, but he openly preached against communism because it was atheistic and it was totalitarian. Again, don't believe everything you read on Facebook. Socialism is not the same thing as communism, though they are overlapping categories. The Baptist World Alliance offered a consistent witness against communism through its Human Rights Commission. Speakers at BWA congresses regularly criticized communism and other threats to religious liberty. In 1949, the BWA helped form what was called the European Baptist Federation to promote Baptist growth in post-war Europe and to do the best they could to track statistics of Baptist churches in communist lands. The BWA considered communism to be a human rights issue, and they routinely found ways to try and aid clandestine Baptist movements in the communist world. Let me just give you one example. During the mid-1980s, nearing the end of communism's reign in Europe at least, the BWA smuggled hundreds of thousands of Bibles into Russia, along with an uncounted amount of other Christian literature. So they were active in that. Despite the BWA's anti-communist stands, Baptist fundamentalists frequently accused it of being soft on communism, largely because the group was global, which made it evil, and advocated world peace rather than the military defeat of communism. And you see this throughout the literature of conservative Christians, that anybody who had more pacifistic tendencies rather than militaristic tendencies was considered to be either a moron or be more often in cahoots with the communists, because only the communists would convince people in the West to be pacifists, because then they could take it over. So the fact that the BWA talked about peace rather than victory smacked of being soft on communism to those who were more right-wing. When the Cold War ended in 1989, persecution began to ease up in those nations formerly under Soviet control. While there were still government obstacles to full religious freedom in some places, and while Russian Orthodoxy and a resurgent Islam provided competition in post-communist Eastern Europe and North and Central Asia, it would be fair to say that in most cases, pressure was more often the norm rather than outright persecution. And by the way, this remains the case in much of the former Soviet world to this day. There is still pressures put upon Christians, but rarely is the pressure so great that I think we would call it outright persecution. However, after the fall of communism, missionaries began to re-engage people groups in formerly Soviet territories that were now once again becoming independent nations. Southern Baptists were some of the first on the ground. A 1992 Southern Baptist resolution read in part, quote, "We urge all Baptist churches, bodies, and appropriate Southern Baptist Convention agencies to marshal their resources and mobilize their members aggressively to seek ways to strike quickly, seizing the moment while the window of opportunity still exists in order to win Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics to Jesus Christ." Let me share just one example of some of the fruit that came out of this new missionary advance. When I arrived at Southeastern Seminary in the summer of 2004, over the course of the first few months I was there, I met 4 young women from Kazakhstan, a historically Islamic nation that had been part of the Soviet Union. When these young women were teenagers, they were among the first converts to be led to Christ in their village in the mid-1990s. And they ended up leading their parents and most of their friends to faith in Christ. Because the missionary who reached them was a Southeastern Seminary graduate, these ladies had all come to Southeastern to pursue theological education. 3 of them ended up members of our former church in North Carolina. Today, one of them is married to the son of a Southeastern staff member. A second married a godly young man this past summer. A third is married to a Southern Baptist church planter in New Jersey. And the fourth is an IMB missionary in East Asia. She and her husband minister to Kazakhs who live in a major city in the large communist country that borders Russia to the southeast. These missionary friends live in constant danger of being expelled from the nation they live in, so since this is being recorded, let the hearer understand. So this concludes my 40,000-foot history of communism persecution with emphasis on the Baptists. What I want to do, though, for the remainder and the majority of my time is to look at some case studies that relate to the persecution of Baptists in specific communist lands. Some of these stories are fairly wide known, and others are just now coming to light. Each of them is a Baptist snapshot that helps to paint the larger picture of communist persecution of Christians between 1917 and 1989. So my first snapshot is the best known, and that's Bill Wallace of China. Bill Wallace was one of the 2 or 3 most famous American missionary martyrs under communism. John and Betty Stamm are really the only ones that would rival him, I think, in terms of being widely known. He's certainly the most famous Southern Baptist missionary martyr probably ever, and certainly of the 20th century. Wallace was born in 1908, the son of a physician. At the age of 17, he felt called to be a medical missionary. In 1935, after finishing his residency at the University of Tennessee Medical Center in Knoxville, Wallace was appointed by the SBC's Foreign Mission Board to serve as a medical missionary to Wuchao, China. During this time, China was in the midst of political upheaval, and many missionaries were leaving for British-controlled Hong Kong. But not Bill Wallace. As Danny Aiken writes, quote, Bill would love and serve the Chinese people for 15 years. His commitment kept him in China through a number of political uprisings, the Japanese invasion of China, World War II, and the communist takeover of China. On more than a few occasions, he would perform surgery with bombs exploding around the hospital. Close quote. Wallace was eventually forced to leave Wuchao for a safer village in China during World War II, but he returned to his hospital as soon as the war ended and resumed his ministry there. Though he wasn't a preacher, and even went so far as to claim to be a poor public speaker, Wallace shared the gospel with those whom he cared for at the hospital. In fact, according to one of his colleagues, a mini revival broke out in Wuchao shortly after Wallace arrived. Dozens of Chinese men and women were converted, and his colleague said it was because of Wallace's winsome evangelistic witness there in the hospital. That was, humanly speaking, the fulcrum of that mini revival. In 1949, Mao Zedong led the communist revolution in China that resulted in that nation becoming the modern-day People's Republic of China. In short order, missionaries were kicked out of the nation, including all of the Southern Baptist missionaries. One such missionary, who you've probably never heard of, was Sophie Lano, a single woman who served in, and I know I'm mispronouncing this, Suzhou for 42 years, which is actually 3 years longer than Lottie Moon served in China. Single female Southern Baptist missionary. She was from Wake Forest. I had the opportunity to deliver a paper on her several years ago. Bill Wallace was never given the chance to be expelled. In December 1950, Wallace and several of his colleagues were arrested after they refused to voluntarily leave Wuchao and return to America. The communist authorities accused Wallace and his co-workers of being American spies. Wallace responded, quote, "We are what we seem to be. We are doctors and nurses and hospital staff engaged in healing the suffering and sick in the name of Jesus Christ. We are here for no other reason." When communists searched Wallace's room at the mission and claimed to have found a handgun confirming that he was a spy, Wallace and others responded that the communists had planted the gun. Wallace did not own a firearm. During 2 months of solitary confinement, the communists starved Wallace, beat him repeatedly, and tried to brainwash him into renouncing his faith in Christ. They also tried to convince the locals to admit that Wallace was a spy and wasn't really a missionary. Even non-believing villagers vouched for Wallace's integrity. On February 10th, 1951, Wallace was beaten to death. The guards hung him from the ceiling and claimed he committed suicide. But 2 Catholic priests who were also imprisoned for being missionaries, as well as the servant who was brought in to clean Wallace's cell, 2 different types of witnesses, claimed there was no evidence that Wallace had hanged himself and lots of physical evidence that he had been severely beaten. The communists circulated rumors that Wallace had renounced Christ in his final days. Nobody believed them. Because of his martyrdom, Wallace became something of a tragic celebrity in America in the years just before Jim Elliot and his 4 companions were martyred in Ecuador. In 1953, Wallace Memorial Baptist Church was founded in Knoxville, Tennessee. It is today one of the leading missions-minded churches in the Tennessee Baptist Convention. In 1963, Jesse Fletcher wrote a best-selling biography titled Bill Wallace of China. And in 1996, Timothy and Denise George edited a second edition of this book as part of their Library of Baptist Classics series. In 1967, the book became the basis of a motion picture that was widely watched by Southern Baptists and other evangelicals. It was sort of like one of the Sherwood Picture type films of its era. It was an explicitly Christian movie that Christian audiences got excited about. In fact, you can purchase an inexpensive DVD of the movie from the Wallace Memorial Baptist Church website. They still sell it. My wife and I watched it about a year and a half ago for the first time. In 1985, Wallace's remains were exhumed from Wuchao and relocated to Wallace Memorial, where he was given the Christian burial service that the communists had denied him in 1951. And in 2012, my friend and former boss, Danny Aiken, included a chapter on Wallace in his book, 10 Who Changed the World, reintroducing a new generation of Southern Baptists to this famous missionary who was martyred because of communism's militant atheism. In the 1960s and 70s, every Southern Baptist pastor knew who Bill Wallace is. I hope that's the case in the coming years as he's reintroduced to a new generation. My second snapshot, also a very famous story, Joseph Sohn of Romania. Another well-known story of persecution. Baptists have been active in Romania since the 1840s, when the famous German evangelist Johann Oncken baptized the first converts. By the way, anybody here know what Oncken's motto was? Every Baptist a missionary. That'll preach. So I commend that to you. So Oncken helps establish Baptist work in Romania. However, it wasn't until the 1910s when Baptists began to really grow, resulting in a Romanian Baptist convention in 1920. However, between the two world wars, the government persecuted Baptists and other evangelicals, in part at the request of the Romanian Orthodox Church, which was anti-evangelical. But far worse than that, in 1947, Romania came under communist control. Romanian Baptists, and this would be the case in many communist puppet states, divided amongst themselves over how to respond to communism. Most of the ministers in the Romanian Baptist Convention agreed to affirm in principle communist rule and abide by government restrictions. This allowed them to have limited freedom of worship, but it restricted their outreach outside of passing it on to their own children. However, many Baptist ministers rejected this compromise. These dissenters were fiercely persecuted, and Joseph Sohn was the most famous of the dissenters. Sohn served as pastor of Second Baptist Church in the city of Oradea during the 1970s. In 1974, he was arrested by Romanian authorities and tortured for his convictions. He was beaten, interrogated, and subjected to brainwashing attempts. Though he was released, he was subsequently arrested several more times over the next 7 years. On several occasions, the communist authorities threatened him with death. And on at least one occasion, they attempted to bribe him into not preaching the gospel anymore. The plight of the Romanian Baptists always held a special place in the hearts of Baptists in America and the Baptist World Alliance, and Sohn's faithfulness in the midst of persecution only furthered this goodwill. Let me share with you a couple of stories of Sohn's persecution, and for the record, I found these particular stories in a news article that my dear friend and fellow Fuller Center fellow Jeff Robinson wrote about 11 years ago. So Jeff, if it sounds like I'm plagiarizing you, I'm not, because I gave you credit. Once a communist agent threatened to kill Sohn, and according to his account, quote, this is Sohn's words, when the secret police officer threatened to kill me, to shoot me, I smiled and I said, "Sir, don't you understand that when you kill me, you will send me to glory? You cannot threaten me with glory. The more suffering, the more troubles, the greater the glory. So why say stop this trouble? Because the more suffering, the greater the glory up there. On another occasion, when Sohn was being held in captivity, this is what he told his communist interrogator. And this is powerful. You should know your supreme weapon is killing. My supreme weapon is dying. Now here is how it works, sir. You know that my sermons are on tape all over this country. When you shoot me or crush me, whichever way you choose, you only sprinkle my sermons with my blood. Everybody who has a tape of one of my sermons will pick it up and say, I'd better listen again. This man died for what he preached. Sir, my sermons will speak 10 times louder after you kill me and because you kill me. In fact, I will conquer this country for God because you killed me. Go on and do it. The communists didn't kill Sohn, but they did boot him out of the country in 1981. He moved to the United States where he founded the Romanian Missionary Society in 1982. And from this new perch, Sohn helped keep Baptists in the West informed about communist actions against Baptists and other evangelicals in Romania. Like most Romanian Baptists, he was theologically conservative, so he cultivated especially close ties with the same Southern Baptist leaders who were leading the SBC during the inerrancy controversy, or what we would now call the conservative resurgence. After communists relinquished control of Romania, Sohn returned to his homeland in 1991. He became a radio broadcaster, established a publishing house, and helped found Emmanuel University in Romania. Emmanuel University was the legal version of an underground seminary that had been founded in the mid-1980s. Today, Emmanuel is the only fully accredited evangelical university in continental Europe. Numerous Southern Baptist professors and pastors have taught at Emmanuel over the years, and my friend Trevin Wax, whom some of you may know from his popular blog or the Gospel Project curriculum published at Lifeway, earned his undergraduate degree and brought home a wife from Emmanuel University. Unfortunately, in recent years, Sohn has been disfellowshipped by Romanian Baptists for embracing Pentecostalism. Nevertheless, his testimony of faithfulness in the midst of persecution continues to inspire Baptists today. In many ways, he is the Baptist Richard Wurmbrand, who we heard about briefly earlier today. Well, I've told you about a couple of famous individuals, so let me step back a bit and speak to persecution in 3 communist nations, so larger trends in particular nations. And I'll begin with Russia. Interestingly enough, Baptists fared okay in the earliest days of Soviet rule. But after Stalin came to power, he moved to suppress Christianity. Churches were closed and all religious education for children was suspended. Bibles could no longer be printed in Russian, pastors were arrested, and a fledgling Baptist Bible college that had just recently been opened was shut down. One historian suggests that Baptists were especially ill-treated by the Stalin regime during the 30s and 40s because many Baptists in that nation were pacifists, and that was an odious position to the Soviet authorities. In Ukraine, where Baptists had been especially strong prior to Stalin, the All-Ukrainian Christian Baptist Union was dissolved, and most of the pastors were either imprisoned or forced into hiding. During World War II, Baptists and other Protestants were granted limited freedom of worship. Stalin wanted to encourage their loyalty to the Soviet Union, even among religious citizens. However, as in Romania, outreach and Christian education were stifled. During this time, again, as was often the case in communist lands, the Baptists were forced to merge with other free church evangelicals in an effort to survive. In 1944, the Union of Evangelical Christians and Baptists, the UECB, was formed. The president of the UECB for 22 years was Jacob Zidkov, a Baptist pastor in Moscow. The government closely monitored churches in the UECB and refused to allow any Bible colleges or seminaries for training ministers. Because of close government supervision, many congregations chose to meet in secret, and few churches, even Baptist churches that prized regenerate church membership, would maintain formal church rolls. After the Russian government decreed that only adults could be members of churches in the 1960s, Russian Baptists also intentionally severed baptism from church membership, allowing them to convert more people than the government could keep tabs on. Many Baptist leaders in the West respected Jacob Zidkov. He was by far the most famous evangelical pastor in the Soviet Union. He was even elected a vice president of the Baptist World Alliance in 1955 after receiving permission from the Soviet government to attend the meeting. Allegedly, Zidkov and a couple of other colleagues were allowed to attend because their translator was a KGB agent who was spying on the meeting. In 1956, the BWA invited 5 Russian Baptist leaders to visit North America and speak at several Baptist denominational gatherings. They basically made the rounds of all the spring and summer denominational meetings. As part of their tour, the Russian Baptists attended the SBC annual meeting in Kansas City. Zidkov spoke several times at the SBC and auxiliary meetings taking place during the SBC. He was able to testify that Baptists who were a part of the UECB enjoyed relative freedom of worship. Zidkov and other Baptists who had received state approval constantly had to balance speaking the truth of communist persecution while also not being so forthright that they brought additional pressures upon themselves. Spies were always listening. For this very reason, this balancing act, not all Baptists were thrilled about the Russian Baptist Goodwill Tour. Fundamentalists, such as the publishers of the Canadian Baptist periodical The Gospel Witness, a magazine that later became more evangelical when edited by the esteemed Michael A.G. Haken, suggested that the visiting Russian Baptists were in cahoots with their atheistic government, and they denounced mainstream Baptist denominations for providing Zidkov and his colleagues with a public platform. The accusation was an overreach. But these fundamentalists knew that those Baptist churches that had remained independent of the UECB, the so-called pure Baptists, basically the Soviet version of the independent Baptist movement in America, these pure Baptists did not enjoy freedom of worship, but instead they were suppressed and their pastors were imprisoned. At least one historian claims that one reason Russian Baptist life floundered during this time was because of resentment between the more radical pure Baptists and the more moderate Baptists aligned with the UECB. We see a similar sort of resentment today in China between house churches and government-sanctioned congregations that are part of the Three Self-Patriotic movement. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, government opposition to both groups of Baptists became far more pronounced. Much of this took the form of atheist propaganda, some of which was directed especially at the Baptists. Numerous anti-Protestant and even anti-Baptist books were published, and most of them were written for teenagers. The hope was to persuade the younger generation to embrace atheism, regardless of whatever religious instruction they were receiving at home from their parents. A growing number of pastors and lay people were imprisoned for violating religious laws, and unfortunately, as is often the case with persecution, many Baptists renounced their faith and became atheists. Many believers were actually put on trial and convicted for crimes against the state for being vocally Baptist. Anti-Christian sanctions began to lift in the mid-1970s. And by the 1980s, though Christianity was still strongly discouraged, there was little outright persecution anymore. Many Russian Baptists regularly listened to Christian radio broadcasts from the West and enjoyed greater access to Bibles and other Christian literature. After communism's demise, Baptists and other evangelicals began to grow numerically. However, and this is interesting, longtime members often claim that their churches were spiritually stronger during the height of communism than they were now that they enjoyed religious liberty. Nobody knows exactly how many Baptists there were in the Soviet Union between 1917 and 1989. Again, they stopped keeping membership rolls. Estimates range widely, and by widely I mean really widely, from a low of 40,000 to a high of 4 million. But spiritually speaking, at least, it seems many Russian Baptists who lived through into the more democratic and capitalistic era would argue that the blood of the martyrs had been seed during the Cold War era. Estonia offers another helpful snapshot of Baptist persecution in communist lands. Estonia is a tiny nation of about 1.3 million citizens. It's located northwest of Russia and directly south of Finland on the other side of the Gulf of Finland. From 1940 to 1991, Estonia was a puppet state of the USSR. As in many other communist lands, the Estonian Baptists were forced to merge with 3 other free church groups into what was called the Union of Evangelical Christian Baptists in Estonia, or the UEC-BE. In his published monograph on this topic, Estonian Baptist historian Toivo Pili argues that this merger transformed Baptist identity in Estonia. On the one hand, all of these evangelical traditions became consistently Baptistic in their ecclesiology because of a result of the Baptist influence in the group. On the other hand, the Baptists inherited traits from the other groups, such as an openness to miraculous gifts that the Pentecostals had contributed to the mix. But for our purposes here, Pili also recounts what persecution looked like among the Estonian Baptists. As in other Soviet republics, Estonian Baptists were severely limited in terms of outreach and education, and the KGB closely monitored their worship gatherings. Anti-Christian and pro-atheist propaganda was par for the course. Estonian Baptist ministers were periodically arrested and interrogated by the secret police. The KGB also tried to discredit the churches that were part of the UECEB, and they did this in 2 different ways. First, they infiltrated churches and sowed mistrust between the different denominational constituents within the UECEB. They especially tried to get everyone else to gang up on the Pentecostals. And if you're wondering why the Pentecostals, it's because the Soviets loathed the Pentecostal emphasis on the supernatural. I mean, these are atheists, right? The only thing worse than Christianity is Christianity that thinks that the Holy Spirit actively performs miracles on a regular basis and people speak in tongues and things like this. They were like ultra-Christians, and that made them very bad. Second, the KGB would sometimes claim that certain ministers were collaborating with them even when it wasn't true. The purpose was to cause congregations to doubt the integrity of their pastors. Estonian Baptists were affected by the same trends as their Russian brethren during the 60s. Government pressure and propaganda increased in an effort to capture the hearts of the younger generation for atheism and gradually starve out Christianity. All Christian activities were restricted except for weekly worship gatherings in church buildings. No home Bible studies, no even church-based social work. No home meetings were allowed without government approval, no home meetings of any kind. Churches that failed to obey the law lost their government registration in the UECEB and were forcibly dissolved. Church meeting houses that were taken control of in this way were turned into community halls, converted into apartment complexes, or simply torn down to make way for new, ugly communist public buildings. Non-compliant ministers were arrested and interrogated. In general, Christianity, and especially evangelicals, were castigated for being too closely tied to capitalism and thus an enemy of communist purity. As with Russia, the intensity of persecution gradually waned during the 1970s. While evangelicalism was still strongly discouraged and atheism was still heavily promoted, in general, Baptists and similar groups were allowed to worship and gather in homes for weekly Bible studies. Fewer churches were closed down and fewer ministers were arrested. Of course, full religious freedom did not come until the post-communist era. As an aside, it's worth noting that Estonian Baptists drew upon the Anabaptist tradition for inspiration and comfort during the hottest years of persecution. This was not so much because of a commitment to an Anabaptist kinship view of Baptist origins, but rather was the recognition that Anabaptists were ecclesiological fellow travelers who had thrived in the 16th century despite intense persecution. Estonian Baptists figured that if Anabaptists could flourish spiritually and even numerically while staring death in the face, surely they could similarly grow while facing lesser threats than outright martyrdom. I would suggest there's a lesson here. When persecution or even just external pressures come upon us, we would do well to look to the Christian past for inspiration for how to be faithful during trying times. The Anabaptists, as well as many of the early church fathers, countless missionaries in hostile cultures, and our Baptist forefathers, should inspire us to be courageous no matter what the world, the flesh, and the devil might throw at us. I have a final snapshot related to Vietnam, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to share that with you. Be happy to talk with you about it over lunch, but we are running behind schedule, and if you're like me, then your tummy is grumbling. So be happy to talk with you about that at lunch, about actually a great revival among Baptist ethnic minorities in Vietnam who have been forced to flee the country. 3,000 of them live in North Carolina, and almost every one of them are now Southern Baptists because of the influence of the Baptist missionaries that were reaching them in the 60s and 70s. These snapshots are just some of the stories of how communists persecuted Baptists between 1917 and 1989. And in the case of those Vietnamese friends the day before yesterday. And remember that we focused on Baptists. When it comes to persecution, communists are often no respecters of denominations. We should thank God that the Cold War is over, but we should not lull ourselves into thinking that the communist threat to Christianity has ended. According to groups like Open Doors, Human Rights Watch, and the Voice of the Martyrs, contemporary communist nations such as Vietnam, North Korea, Laos, and China still actively persecute believers. While Cuba has lessened its restriction on Christianity in the last few years, it's still uncertain what the future holds for believers in that nation. Everyone agrees that Islamic radicalism is now the single biggest source of Christian persecution in the world today, but it is not the only threat. As long as communism continues to eke out an existence, Christianity will be threatened. So let's remember to pray for two things: that communism will finally be rejected the world over, and that Christians suffering in communist lands will be faithful unto death. Thank you very much.